I'm going to begin.
You about ready? Okay, Carolee, why don't you
Okay.
start?
I want to welcome everyone this evening. My name is Carolee Hall, and this is the Willoughby Wallace Library's presentation of Rising Seas and the Future of the Wonderful 146. I know that everybody at this presentation knows what 146 is, and I think it's one of the most beloved community resources in both Guilford and in Brantford, which is rare in itself. Most people probably know that it was designated a scenic road in 1990 under state statute. It was, I believe, the second scenic road in the state, and I want to say that that was largely a result of the work of Lauren Brown and John Herzan, Stony Creek residents still. The eastern portion of the road was put on the National Register of Historic Places also in 1990. These designations should tell us, if we don't already know it, about the high quality of the environmental, historic, and scenic resources in this wonderful road. Those of us who travel the road, however, have probably noticed recently, or not so recently, at least certainly the last 10 years, the increasing presence of water. Water on the road, water, stormwater, water, more water in the marsh, seemingly higher tides. Could this possibly be? And the question really, of course, is what are the implications of this water for the future of Route 146? Peter Hentschel, who is going to give our presentation tonight, is both an architect and planner. He's been the representative for the RTM 2nd District in Brantford for some time now. He's been a resident of Stony Creek for 50 years. How can that be, Peter? And most importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, he is the chairperson of the Brantford Coastal Vulnerability Working Group. As a result, he knows a lot about rising water. And so I think his presentation tonight is as timely as it is eagerly awaited. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Carolee. Couple of things before we get started. Just wanted to let you know that I put together this presentation basically at the request of the Willoughby Wallace Library after we had looked at some earlier material that I had generated. This is not, although I am the chairperson of the Brantford's Coastal Vulnerability Working Group, this is not a presentation coming from that group. It is just, it's a personal presentation that I put together myself. We will be recording the presentation, and hopefully if everything goes well and the recording works, the library can clean that up and edit it and put it on the website. So it will be hopefully available on the Willoughby Wallace, wwml.org, I guess events would be where it would be posted in the future. Everybody is going to remain muted for the duration of my presentation. I won't be taking live questions at the end, although I will be happy to take questions if you have them and can, during the presentation, can type them into chat as a question. At the end, Carolee and Alice will pick a few, and depending on the time we have available, I'll try to answer as many of those as I can. If you have additional questions you'd like to ask me, and you can email them to the library. I'll give you the address at the end again, but it's librarystaff@brantford-ct.gov. And that should get you to the Willoughby Wallace staff, and they will forward any question you might have to me. I'll respond, and hopefully with an answer if I can do that. So with that said, I'll get started here. As Carolee has said, my presentation really, it's about water. I'm not going to be talking about all of the other wonderful aspects of 146. that I know have been in the public discussion recently, but I'm going to focus totally on water and how water is impacting that beautiful road. And this is the condition I think that we're all familiar with now. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a little bit clearer idea of what's going on, why this type of flooding is happening, what the future might look like. Again, looking at this is a satellite image of the area. I'm going to be focusing pretty much entirely on the area of 146 from Stony Creek down to the Guilford town line, which is roughly in here. I'm sure most of you can pick out the features just looking at this, but obviously 146 meanders down along the edges of the marsh, comes down under the railroad tracks and into Guilford. It's transected by the railroad line, which is mostly elevated as it comes through the center of this zone here. And there are two primary marshes, very significant marshes for Branford's sake. One is the one that centers around Jarvis Creek and comes up around here and comes along the edge of 146 for quite a distance and then back down. The other is the marsh that centers around Hoadley Creek, and that's this marsh here, and that also comes up and edges against the railroad tracks and impacts the underpass, the rail underpass here, and comes up against the edge of 146 when you're in Guilford down here. So the question here is what's causing the coastal flooding that we see in this area, and what are some of the elements that make that flooding either worse or less, and how might this be changing in the future? At this point in Long Island Sound, there are primarily four major drivers of the water level in the Sound. One is obviously the high tide itself. Another is the effect of wind. Now, I'm not talking about storms here. I'm just talking about a windy day. Wind can have just mild winds can have a significant impact if they drive down the Sound on the level of water. The third one is the one that we all see every few years, which is the storm-driven surge. This storm-driven surge, and that would be what you might see associated with a hurricane or a major nor'easter. And I think we've all lived through that in our area to date. And the last is what is, I'm sure, of concern to a lot of us, and maybe should be of more of concern to a lot of us, which is sea level rise, and what that impact is going to be along the coast, especially in Branford. So I thought to begin with, I'm going to give you a little primer on tides. And a lot of you, I'm sure, are very conversant with, all the subtleties of tides and what causes them, et cetera. But I think it's important to understand, make sure that you understand this and understand how tides are measured, because that impacts, what we see when water hits land, the edge of land. As everybody knows, we're along the East Coast. We're in a daily semi-diurnal tide cycle, meaning we have two high tides every day, spaced approximately 12 and a half hours apart. One thing that you might not know is that typically those peaks are not one to the next, or not about the same. There's usually about a foot difference up and down as you go through the daily cycle of high tide, so that there is a variation in the high tide every day. If you look at what happens monthly, it gets relatively dramatic. You can see some major changes in water level, and this is a full year graph. But if you look at this, it's pretty apparent that twice a month, or twice a lunar month, we're actually hitting extreme accentuated high tides in our area, and one typically is higher than the other. And what the highest one is usually the full moon peak tide, and the other peak that is not sort of baby peak is the new moon high tide, and that can drive tide levels up at least a foot above what you might see as average tides, a foot to a foot and a half. So there's quite a range in terms of what tides will do. But the important thing is that 7 feet. To remember the tide can be 7 feet, and that's from the apparent zero or mean low water zero line. When you hit those peaks, there's also the water drops another foot below the normal low, so the range is actually higher than the 7 feet. Most of us know that this is caused by the alignment of the moon, the sun, and the earth. And those high tides are called spring tides, and they are when the moon and the earth and the sun are in alignment. If the moon is a full moon, that typically raises the water to its greatest height. And if it's a new moon, it's high, but not quite as high as the full moon. When the moon is at the quarter points, or perpendicular to the axis of the earth and sun, that's when we hit the neap tides, the lower tides during that monthly cycle. So one probably obvious but important thing to remember is that when you're talking terminology, land elevations are not the same as what we call the height of the tide or the tidal elevations. And if you look at a little cross-section diagram of the land, on the right, tides are measured typically by NOAA. They're measured and recorded by NOAA at tide stations, starting with the low water, which is called mean low water, which is the average low water line. That's down here. It goes up to mean low water and then to the mid tide level, which is sort of halfway between. And then on the top end, you have the mean high water, the average high water, and the mean high water lines is heights of water. If you look at land elevations, this is what a surveyor would use if they're surveying. And I'm going to go back a second. The other thing that is probably obvious to most people is that this range varies dramatically depending on where you are along the coast. If you're up in the Bay of Fundy, that extreme can be up to 20 feet. If you're down in Florida, that can be just a couple of feet. So, and even along Long Island Sound, there's a variation in terms of the high and low tides at any given point. The average or the mean tide is roughly the same, but this range changes dramatically. But the land elevations that a surveyor uses are consistent. They're standardized across the U.S. by the U.S. Geological Survey. So zero elevation in Stony Creek is the same as zero elevation in Boston and zero elevation in Seattle. There is no difference in that measurement of the height of the land. The zero elevation from a surveyor's point of view, typically it was what they called sea level, and the sea level is actually the average between the high and the low tide. So zero elevation is roughly at the mean tide level in this area. The high tide in this area equates to about 2.85 feet of a land survey. And going back to looking at these extremes, if you take that and look at it relative to the extremes, it's pretty apparent that when we hit these 7-foot highs just on a normal spring tide, not a wind-driven tide or a storm-driven tide, but just a spring tide in the lunar cycle, at 7 feet, that's equating to almost 3.5 feet of land elevation that the water is at that point. So how does that look? If you look at a piece of survey information, this is happens to be a section of 146 roadway here. And it shows the land topographic lines. The dark lines are every 5 feet. The light lines are every 1 foot. And I've just highlighted this particular section. The actual roadbed is 4 feet in land elevation up here. It's 4 feet down here, and it dips down between there. So between those two 4-foot lines is a drop in 146. And remember now that the peak spring tides can be roughly 4 feet in height. So that dip now becomes just in a normal lunar high tide becomes susceptible to flooding. If you want to see it on a cross section of the roadbed, this would be the roadbed dipping down, getting close to 3 feet at its low point. If you look at the regular high tides, they're going to be just shy of the roadbed. Then you get a spring tide, and all of a sudden you have, the road flooded, and these dips can be flooded 6 to 8 inches. So that's what this would look like in a plan view. This area, shaded area here, is in fact flooded. And if you look at this is an actual photograph of the right of that same identical section of road taken at Sawmill Road, and that's showing that the flooding is roughly at land elevation 4 in that area. And this is what it looks like. This is what we're all used to seeing. So the next, with that's just the static tide information that impacts us, every day and through the monthly period lunar cycle. If you look at wind can drive that higher, and we're all familiar with this. This is Stony Creek, near the post office, running down to the docks, and this would be a little bit of wind. You can see the flag is coming. Wind is being driven down the sound from the east. This is probably just a high tide, wind driven, starting to come across the road. And if that peaks along with an actual spring tide, we see this usually 3, 4, 5 times a year in Stony Creek, where the wind coincides with a spring tide, and we get this kind of flooding happening. The last or the next, impact, if you get storm surge itself, now this is where we have a major wind-driven event. It's typically a hurricane, could be a nor'easter, but storm surge is a combination of wind impacting on the sea level rise plus the atmospheric pressure drop typically associated with a major storm, or two significant features that suck up the water, raise the elevation over what it would normally be at that whatever given time of day that event was happening. And it can be dramatic. This is Stony Creek in 2011, Hurricane Irene. This was a relatively mild hurricane compared to ones that have had, but the surge can be up in our area, can be up to 8 feet of storm surge. And that's 8 feet above whatever the tide would have been at that time of day. So if it happens to coincide with a high tide, it's going to be pretty dramatic with 8 feet. If it happened to coincide with a spring tide, high tide, it could be, devastating in our area. And the last on the list of 4 things that are impacting our water level is sea level rise itself. And we know that the data has shown worldwide that sea level is, over the last century, has risen somewhere between 5 and 9 feet, depending on where you are. That's an average. It's been more dramatic in some areas, and in fact, along the northeast coast, the sea level rise is more dramatic, especially on the more southern areas, starting with New Jersey, running down to Florida. This is, among other things, due to the fact that the currents are warming and widening, and that's pushing water toward the land and raising the sea level. But Yukon and Circa have done extensive studies on the near-term future projections of sea level rise in Long Island Sound. There's been a lot of research done. And in fact, the Governor's Council on Climate Change just issued their phase 1 report on near-term actions just this past month. And in it, they had near-term predictions for sea level rise, which are relatively dramatic. And what they're saying is that the mean sea level in Long Island Sound could be up to 20 inches above the national tidal datum. That's the numbers we see today by 2050. That's 30 years, essentially 20 inches in 30 years could occur. They're also saying that they have a relatively high level of confidence in these projections, the projections through mid-century, and that this projection is not sensitive to future trends in carbon dioxide emissions. So even if we're successful in starting to drop our carbon dioxide emissions in the near term, we're not going to be able to stop this rise in sea level. And what they're saying that in addition to just the fact that the sea level itself is rising, there are other side effects of that. One is that the coastal flood risk could increase by a factor of 5 to 10 with no change in storm conditions, just, on a daily basis. And the other is that the high water levels, ones that occur during storms, Superstorm Sandy, could be expected as frequently as every 5 to 10 years. So that's a pretty dramatic change in the events that are going to be the super events impacting the water, and especially how it impacts on 146. Their more dire side comment was that if that sea level rise will continue after 2050, and recent simulations indicate that the mean sea level could be up to 80 inches higher by the turn of the century, and that's if CO2 emissions are not reduced soon. So hopefully we'll be able to start to make changes in our CO2 emissions. But if we don't, the impact is going to be devastating for our area. So going back to, what does this mean relative to things we see every day? If you again look at this picture of what could be a spring tide in Stony Creek today. Now, if you add 20 inches of sea level rise on top of that, this is what that same area is going to look like just, on a normal monthly peak spring tide. And this is something this is a picture taken during one of the hurricanes, but this is in fact about 20 inches higher than the picture on the left in terms of where the water level is. So coming back to 146, looking at these conditions and how they would impact on 146 itself, starting with the high tides, the spring tides. If you have wind-driven spring tides under current conditions, this is a graphic showing where the water level would be rising to with that type of an event. So if you look at that, the first thing you're going to see is that in the area where this is down, where the tide gate in the boardwalk, the Land Trust boardwalk, and the causeway run from Stony Creek over toward Guilford, the marshland under the boardwalk is completely flooded in these conditions. Come up to 146, and as we have seen quite frequently, there are at least 2 areas of 146 along the Jarvis Creek marsh that get flooded with anywhere from 3 to 9 inches of water. And then down where the railroad underpass occurs just before you get into Guilford, and there's an actual piece of marsh inland of the railroad tracks and inland of 146 there that's fed by pipes underneath of that underpass. That gets flooded itself in addition with anywhere from 3 to 9 inches of water. If you look at this same area now with hurricane flooding, and at this point in time, the best indicator of hurricane risk assessment is the FEMA maps that have been created, which indicate what they consider to be the very peak water levels and how they might impact on property. It's important, I think, to note a couple of things about FEMA. Number one is that their mapping is retrospective. So all the data that they use to create these flood zones is not current data. It's certainly not future data projecting sea level rise, but it's in fact historic past. It can be several decades old, and there have been many instances in the country where FEMA flood data has, in coinciding with a storm event, where the storm event has been significantly higher than anything that FEMA projected for that area. But you overlay onto this the FEMA map, and there are a couple of zones here. The coastal zone, which is the high velocity zone, you can see hatched in this area here, which is the lower part of Jarvis Creek, the lower part of Hoadley Creek, up to about where the tide gate is here. And then the upper area of the marsh, which is all this area up in here, you can see very significant areas of flooding here that could potentially happen if we have a major hurricane in the right conditions. So looking at the tide gate, in that zone, the height, the projected height is 13 feet. This is land elevations, 13 feet. What that would mean is that the tide gate itself, the tide gate that you can walk across, is covered by up to 5 feet of water. The boardwalk could be covered by roughly 4 feet of water in that area. And in addition, the little causeway that connects the tide gate with Guilford would also be covered with about 4 feet of water. If you look at the railroad underpass, in that area, the water levels get up to about 12 feet land elevation in there. The rail bed is about 20 feet, so the water is still below the rail bed, but it's getting relatively close to the actual rail bed and would be completely engulfing the underpass. Then you come up the 146 itself, and this area is projected to be at 11 feet land elevation. So the low spots we've been talking about with, anywhere from 5 to 9 inches of water today at a spring tide, they could be flooded with up to 4 feet of water in those areas. And you can see that it crosses the road in many areas. It comes way up in a section of 146 that we don't see flooded now, well beyond Sawmill. And of course, the area down around the underpass is completely flooded in that area. Looking at this in a slightly different type of mapping, this is the same set of conditions zoomed in. You can see where the water line is with the light blue-green tone here. This is the boardwalk, the Land Trust boardwalk here. That's completely covered. That could be overtopped by up to 9 feet. The dike could have up to 8 feet, and the causeway could have up to 8 feet of storm water here. Medlin's farm area would be the edges of it would be completely flooded, and it would be getting into the actual farm itself. And as I've mentioned, the sections of 146 that are prone to flooding now would be completely inundated. Could have upwards of 5 to 7 feet of surge. So all told, what this looks like is basically water levels that are, depending on where you are in the range of, in a major storm, in the right situation, could be up to 8 feet above, whatever the tide level was. If it was a high tide, that would be elevation, quite significant land elevations. So what are the areas that the choke points, I'm calling them choke points, that impact how water gets up into the upper areas of the marsh here. And there are really four areas of choke point. So the first one is the one we've talked about before. It's the land trust boardwalk coming across here, the dike, which is the tidal gate, but the tide gate has been, the actual gate has been gone for, I think, about 15 years. And then the boardwalk, not the boardwalk, the causeway in this area here. Those three elements are potentially areas that could control, how water progresses beyond that point. If you look at the railroad underpass, that area that is going to be flooded, but it's not going to have much of an effect on. It's a choke point, but it wouldn't have much effect on water progressing up into the top. There's additionally a underpass, which if people who hike in this area are familiar with, it runs in toward Medlin Farm, but that underpass is higher, land elevation is higher than normal flood water, so it would be only in a hurricane situation that water might get through there. And the last choke point is the area at where 146 goes underneath of the railroad at close to the Guilford town lines. So the issues with doing anything to stop water flowing past these points, the railroad underpass, the tide gate, and the land trust boardwalk, Medlin Farm underpass, and the railroad underpass, are essentially, we're dealing with four relatively tightly controlled elements here. One is the tidal marshland itself, one is Amtrak, and one is Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, Connecticut DEEP's, their policy, and the other is the current lack of any sophisticated technical solutions to floodgates and tide gates. DEEP has a policy of discouraging any control of water that's feeding marshlands, because when water is controlled into a marsh, it tends to start to kill the marsh. Marshes survive on a very narrow tidal range, and if the water is either too high or too low, the marsh will not survive in its current healthy state. It tends to degrade. If it's too high, it turns into mud flats. If it's too low, it dies out, gets covered with other types of vegetation. So DEEP has a policy of not really wanting people to do anything to alter the flow of water into marshlands, and that would be including the use of tide gates, either new tide gates or rebuilding tide gates such as this that have deteriorated and in this case vanished. Amtrak is extremely sensitive about the use of their elevated road beds to control coastal flooding. They have enough of a problem on their hands right now dealing with the impacts of sea level rise on their embankments where they exist, and any thought of putting a gate connected to a water underpass under the railroad roadbed is something that they won't even consider talking about. That's been an issue in downtown Brantford, where the rail line connects toward the senior center and floods, and the town has been trying to develop some level of tide control there, flood control there, and been pretty unsuccessful in talking to Amtrak or getting any response from Amtrak on being able to actually put anything in that closes off those places where water goes under the railroad. There are, in some people in some areas of the world, have started to look at more sophisticated types of tide gates that are technology driven, and they can control peak tides and still into marshlands while they still allow the what would be considered to be a healthy flow of water into the marshland. Those typically in our area have not been adopted currently by DEEP, and this is something that may develop further in the future as an available technology to control water in an area such as we see here with the Jarvis Creek, but they don't exist now, and they're not encouraged by DEEP, and DEEP would control anything that's done to any one of these features in a marsh. So going back to what this means in terms of 146, what can be done to address flooding. I'm not trying to make any proposals in terms of what might be the best approach here, but it would seem to me, given the fact that we have some relatively highly consistent near-term projections of flooding up to mid-century, that it might be reasonable to address flooding by minimal road elevation changes in the low spots to get those road beds up to approximately a land elevation, survey elevation of about 6.5 feet, which would mean some of those low spots might be filled in with anywhere from 0 to 30 inches of fill. Again, going back to that diagram that we looked at of 146 here, and you look at it in 2050 with the 20 inches of sea level rise, that's the area essentially that you'd have to fill as road bed. So you'd be filling the road bed to get it up above these flooded spots. You'd be filling, 26, 28 inches, depending on where you were. And that these are the areas, if you're looking down at 146, these are the low spots currently that sort of fall into that category. So that would be a sort of a short-term fix to get us through mid-century. If you look at the seawall installing a seawall at the underpass where the road curves underneath of the railroad near the Guilford town line, this little section here, it would be technically possible to put a seawall in there, close off the pipe that goes underneath and feeds this marsh here with a tide gate, and that might be a solution that would control the sort of normal peak lunar high tides, the spring high tides. It's not going to control hurricane types of conditions, storm conditions, but it would control the monthly high tide conditions, especially, it could control them up through mid-century by a solution such as this. So again, I think that a sort of prudent approach to this would be, doing some moderate infilling of the low points of 146, getting ourselves to mid-century, then assessing where we stand with sea level rise at that point, what the projections are, how successful we've been with our carbon emissions, and whether there are any new and more acceptable technology-driven types of controls that in our case, where we have these inland marsh areas, could be used to control the water. Again, this is all going to be these solutions. Any solution we pick, if sea level continues to rise, is going to be have a time window where it may function successfully for a period of time, and then after that, it would be basically back to the drawing board with reassessing where we stand. So that's the end of the presentation. Again, if you want to email questions to me, you can do it through the library staff at branford-ct.gov. If Carol Lee and Alice have any specific questions at this point for me, I can try to answer those. So, Carol Lee, do I need to unmute you, or can you unmute yourself?
I'm unmuted,
Okay.
but I don't see any questions. Alice, do you? We'll repeat again that if there are questions from the audience, you should put them into the chat area of the Zoom meeting, and Alice and I will try to convey a few of them to Peter right now.
Do you see that one, Caroline?
Yeah, I don't think that has anything to do with, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so Peter, there's a question here about policy. I think the person is asking who's in charge of the next steps.
Well, in terms of 146 itself, we know that there is the current study going on by Scrogg of 146 that Guilford and Branford have entertained to give some advice to DOT about how they might address any changes to this section of 146. If those changes impact, or as soon as those changes impact on the marshland, which in this case is basically the edge of the road, you're immediately into control by deep. So essentially any of the changes that I've talked about as possibilities here would be changes that ultimately would have to probably be proposed by DOT, and then they'd have to work with deep to see whether they could, from a technical point of view, a design point of view, come up with an acceptable solution that met deep standards for encroachment into the marsh area. Deep controls the marshes up to the high water, basically the high water level. So anything in the marsh below the high water level is under deep control. It's not under town control. And on the state level, any other state agency would have to get deep approval if they were going to impact in those areas.
Peter, there's another question now that you mentioned the marshes. Someone is asking who's keeping an eye on the marshes, the health of the marshes in the face of all this water.
That's a good question. And I can't give you an answer to it. I know that there is a group that I think the Nature Conservancy was part of, and I listened to a very informative webinar about marsh migration and marshland, and that group seemed to be very both conversant with the state of marshes in various areas along the Connecticut coast and the factors that impacted them. I've been trying to make contact with the group to see whether we could start to develop a dialogue and understand better whether they could actually look and start to assess some of Branford's marshlands in terms of the state of health. But nothing has moved forward yet on that score. So, I can't say, I don't think that deep does not really monitor the health of the marshes in terms of sort of keeping tabs on it. I would imagine that there's some level of Circa's involvement, Yukon Circa, in the health of our marshes. But I think that probably a combination of Circa and the Nature Conservancy would be the two best sources of people who may be monitoring our various marshes. We are part of the Coastal Vulnerability Working Group's mission is going to be to look at Brantford's relatively significant number of marshlands and assess them and answer that question basically relative to our marshes. So basically more to come. I think Bill Horn has suggested an answer to it. Well, if I can find Bill, I can see whether he wants to unmute himself.
Peter,
I'm not finding Bill. Yep, go on.
can you remind people that we'll be posting this on the library website? Because someone asked where they can find this presentation.
Okay. Yeah, this presentation's been recorded. It's going to be recorded on the Willoughby Wallace Library website. It's www.ml.org/events. I believe, Alice, that's the correct location in your website for a posting of the recording. Is that correct?
No, it will be on our YouTube channel.
Oh, on your YouTube channel.
Hmm.
Okay. Can that YouTube
questions could be emailed to the library staff at librarystaff@brantford-ct.gov. And Peter, Bill Horn has replied and is saying that as to the marshes, that Yale scientists have been studying the marsh for many years. So there has been significant both monitoring and actual measuring of the marsh health for some time now. It may well be that we could add to the library site some of the scientific data, should it exist in a form that would allow that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe when we post the this presentation on the YouTube, we can also put a couple of links to informative sources such as that.
There was a question here, Peter. I think I know that you haven't studied the Guilford end of 146 with the thoroughness that you approached the Brantford side, but someone asked if there were differences between the Guilford 146 stretch and the Brantford 146 stretch.
Well, number one, yes, I'm sure there are differences. I have not studied it, so I can't say what they are, but typically one element that I think is important in each case where the tidal marsh borders 146 is what's in between that point and Long Island Sound. So in our area where we've looked, for instance, on Jarvis Creek, we have a couple of land features like the railroad berm and the tide gate, the features around the tide gate that are basically between the Sound and the upland area, and may have some impact on how the marsh is impacting the road. The marshes in Guilford, I'm not sure what is in between where they touch the road in Long Island Sound. If anything, they may be completely open to the Sound. So the there would be differences between them. The actual graphic of how what water levels are in those areas, with 20 inches of sea level rise, et cetera. There are a bunch of very good online web tools that will allow you to graphically take a look at any area along the coastline and project various levels of storm, various levels of sea level rise onto that graphic to see where the water is encroaching and how high it's encroaching. So you know, it would be, if somebody is interested in a particular area in Guilford, they could use those tools to get more information on how water is impacting and going to impact that section of the marsh that they're interested in, but I haven't studied it.
Peter, there's another question about how individuals could lobby for some of the changes that you suggest in the presentation.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that right now, through the responses to the Scroggs study, and I think that public input may be over. I believe they may be having one more session in the future for public input, but that probably is the most direct source for input that you know, is going to be picked up by people who are actually looking at these features. But basically DOT and Scrogg are the only two players in this. If you were going to lobby for any changes to the area where the land trust boardwalk, the tide gate, and the causeway are, that would have to go too deep, and frankly, I'm not quite sure what exactly you'd be lobbying for, because as I said before, I don't think there are any acceptable solutions to controlling water across that line at this point that I know of, that would both control the water and maintain the health of the marsh.
Peter, I think there's one last question that we have time for, and it has to do with someone is asking about the chances of the worst case scenario actually taking place by mid-century. And if there's a good chance that the worst case scenario will occur by mid-century, then shouldn't we be planning for more drastic solutions? And I think that's what your work group is thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, again, the Circa Yukon study information that has been presented to the Governor's Council to develop a strategy, a state strategy to sea level rise is fairly confident in the projections, the planning projections of 20 inches by mid-century. And, you know, they're not saying it's going to be 20 inches, but they're saying we should be planning for 20 inches. And they're also saying that they have a pretty high level of confidence that that set of conditions is going to occur. I think that looking at trying to make changes to 146 in particular that would resolve flooding in even more extreme conditions, and in particular in a hurricane situation, I think is something that probably is not, it's just not practical to do at this point in time. One thing that's important to note with the idea of filling the low spots up to, you know, somewhere around 30 inches of fill at the lowest spot is that if you look at the residences that border 146 in those areas, it's still feasible to raise the road roughly to that point and not have any devastating impact on their front yards, their residences itself. But if we start to go higher than that, try to raise 146 anything higher than that, all of a sudden the problems and the issues really start to compound themselves with both the impact on residential land, probably much greater impact on the edge of the marsh, where you have to widen the slope of the road to raise it up. So, you know, I don't have any good recommendations for more aggressive solutions at this time. And as I say, I think that looking at something that could get us, you know, a few decades into the future, successfully get rid of the flooding we occurs very regularly right now, and then see where we stand at that point is probably a more prudent approach than trying to solve what, could be frankly a devastating problem. If we don't solve climate change, none of these beautiful features of land that we're looking at in our communities, Stony Creek, et cetera, they're just not going to exist. So, hopefully we can put our efforts to resolving or mitigating some of that impact before we start to plan for devastatingly high change in sea level rise.
Peter, that's about as much time as we have, and I just wanted to take 1 second to thank Alice for giving you the venue for this extremely interesting presentation. Thank you for doing it, and to convey the many, many responses on the chat function that have said that the presentation is very informative and extremely well done. So thank you very much.
Great.
And we'll go on to the next chapter.
Good. I hope people